Is it me, or the more I watch mainstream media, the more I feel that the Ukrainians are about to storm the Kremlin? I'm not sure, but I think it's the other way around. Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here's the latest update about the Russo Ukrainian War. If you have any new information, any updates, just comment them below. This is a place where we cut the BS and where you learn what's actually going on. And if you want to support my work, help me buy new equipment, make sure to support me on Patreon. Alright boys, listen up. There are currently 3 battles that you have to keep track of. The ongoing siege at Mariupol, the Battle of Izyum, and the siege of Mykolaiv. And there's another city that I'll tell you more about later in the video that we hope the Russians don't capture or it's game over. GG, well played. Anyway, this time no foreplay. Are you ready? We jump right in. What's the general military situation? No Twitter experts seem to even care about it, but it seems the Russians have changed their overall strategy. Since the Russian forces in southern Ukraine have demonstrated the greatest capabilities to date, I believe, and that's my opinion, that their new goal is to liberate all the remaining territories of Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, aka the Donbass. And this would allow the completion of a double objective. Militarily, it allows the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the triangle Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Severodonetsk. And politically, Putin can claim his first major win. That part of his Ukraine intervention has been completed with the liberation of all Donetsk and Lugansk. But don't worry, it's getting worse. This could explain why they've been so persistent in capturing every village one by one on the Donbass contact line, and in reducing the Ukrainian pocket in Mariupol. And it also explains why the Ukrainians have been so reluctant to abandon this area. If this military-political objective is achieved, Russian forces may attempt to capture Zaporizhia from both the west and east bank of the Dnieper River. Meanwhile, the Russians are about to liberate Kherson Oblast as they now control 99% of the region, especially with the capture of Novovorontsovka and Kochubevka. Real tongue twisters. Took me 10 tries to get it right. Some even talk about the possible creation of a Kherson People's Republic. And if we follow that logic, the Zaporizhia People's Republic is not far behind. And I can already guess that in both referendums, 110% of people will vote to join Russia. Even the dead will come back to vote. But you kind of see what is Russia's plan here. And since Putin is still plugged in 1800, he doesn't consider these regions to be part of historic Ukraine anyway. That's basically what he meant when he said he's not gonna occupy Ukraine. His understanding of Ukraine. Nonetheless, the total number of Russian armed forces in Ukraine is objectively insufficient for fast and decisive flank coverage and encirclement of thousands of Ukrainian troops in fortified positions. And this is what some of you have been saying in the comment section of my previous video. Therefore, the Russian military changed its initial tactics of a cavalry charge to the systematic destruction of enemy forces with heavy reliance on artillery. So now that we covered the macro, what's actually going on underground? I think the reason the world is shocked by the performance of the Russian army also stems from how everyone really underestimated the Ukrainian armed forces. After their defeat in 2014, and with the help of NATO advisors and equipment, they modernized and restructured their army for the inevitable round 2. Now, we see a lot of images, videos on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. And that's the problem. We only see snippets of the war, driven from a very effective Ukrainian information war machine, which makes it that their side of the story is much more abundant online. And now the so-called Twitter experts build their entire analysis on these 100% biased snippets. And the problem is that these experts won't do the intellectual, scientific effort to actually see what's on the other side in a very echo chamber fashion. So I did it for them, I did it for you. I dived into Russian Telegram groups. And now 100% I'm on an NSA watch list. And now that I think about it, I should have cleaned up my entire browsing history. But at least NSA agents get to see my videos before everyone else. Premium access. On the other side of Mordor, we see Russian soldiers chilling with civilians. We see them getting their hands on abandoned Ukrainian vehicles, fully intact trucks, tanks, and armored vehicles, and they're proudly handing them to their men to use. What they seem to be the most proud of is using NATO weapons, mainly ATGMs, like the NLAW and the German Panzerfaust 3. They're proudly training their men on how to use these NATO weapons to their full capacity. Just like the Ukrainians, they also post about drone strikes on enemy armored vehicles, and post about Ukrainian soldiers they recently captured. And for some reason they love to interview them. Okay, Dimitri, here, read. I am well treated. And then you have Chechens live streaming everything on TikTok, as if they were gonna start a new reality TV show about it. What you rarely see on mainstream media is how the Russians are using missiles to strike behind the front and systematically destroy all sorts of Ukrainian military facilities, like numerous repair plants. Now, a lot of Ukrainian aircraft and vehicles simply can't be repaired and have to be abandoned. They also continuously destroy one by one all fuel and ammunition storage of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. For example, in the West, we were shocked at how the Russians managed to destroy a large underground ammunition depot in Ivano-Frankivsk using hypersonic Kinjal missiles. The worst is I'm not done. The Russians also target facilities housing military personnel, like the strike on the International Training Center at Yavoriv, which killed and wounded hundreds, but also the strike of a caliber missile on the military base of the 79th Air Assault Brigade in Mykolaiv, which caused at least 50 to 100 fatalities and many more wounded. Lately, a strike in Zhytomyr killed and wounded another 100 Ukrainian soldiers. And in the night of March 21st, they struck another training facility in Rivne Oblast, with up to 100 casualties. All these strikes are starting to add up. Now some French and American experts claim that this is Russia's last-ditch effort, that they're about to collapse and that they barely have any missiles left. Maybe. We hope so. The problem is that if these experts are wrong, there are no direct consequences to them. They were just wrong. However, if the Ukrainian General Staff makes a bad decision, it will cost them tremendously. And one mistake can cause massive casualty. For example, one of the strikes on the military barracks was allegedly caused because one British volunteer entered his phone and the Russians pinpointed this location and just bombed it. Let's talk about the Battle of Mariupol. At this point, Mariupol seems to get the Grozny skincare treatment, and Ukrainian defenses are likely to get cut in half very soon. Once that happens, coordinated defense will become even more difficult. The worst is that Ukrainians in Mariupol are constantly asking for a counterattack, for a relief mission to save them. But currently the Ukrainian General Staff said this was not possible. It's not gonna happen. And the government told them that surrender is not an option either. So I don't know what's the morale situation for the defenders, but it can't be that great. Also, the media and various experts claim that the Russians are so slow to capture the city, basically to show how incompetent they are. Anyway, as a reminder, it took the American-Iraqi coalition 9 months to secure Mosul. The city was defended by 15,000 insurgents against 115,000 allies, a ratio of 7.5 to 1, with the complete air supremacy of the Americans. Meanwhile, Mariupol has been steadily fortified since 2014. Its 15,000 defenders are armed to the teeth and know every corner of the city, against at most 25,000 Russians, a ratio of 1.5 to 1. Let's hope that the defenders at Mariupol stay strong, because every day they hold is another day that Kiev can reinforce other positions. However, the Russians also learned some things from their Syrian campaign. They know that the defenders will eventually run out of ammunition, food and/or water. Now they don't want them to fight until the last man, so the Russians are creating humanitarian corridors. Number one, it allows civilians to leave, so they can bomb the city in peace and operate freely. Let me be clear, Russians have no incentive to keep civilians in the town. None. And number two, it allows combatants to leave in secret, disguised as civilians, as long as they leave their weapons behind. This reduces the cohesion and the overall number of defenders. Basically, it's a low-cost way to capture a city, and a win-win situation for both sides. The Russians capture the territory they want, and the encircled combatants can escape and fight another day. Now, the siege of Mariupol is important because the moment the Russians finalize the capture of the city, it will free up a lot of their forces, either to threaten the Ukrainian troops stuck in Donbass, or reinforce the Russian offensive towards Mykolaiv and Odessa. Lately, there has been a lot of footage of the urban street battle between Ukrainians and Russians at Mariupol. They're literally fighting for every street corner. Urban warfare is also difficult for the attackers since you have to fight in a 3D environment where you can be shot at from a high angle, and cover cannot be used in the same way as it is on the ground. Snipers are also a real threat, and soldiers have to find ways to deal with them. For example, once a sniper is spotted, a Russian tank rolls in and fires a straight shot at it. And did you know that there was no Russian word for collateral damage? And lastly, to reach the upper floors of high-rise buildings, the Russians brought back medieval warfare by using ladders, a tactic already used by the army of the Philippines. Let's move north to the Battle of Izyum. I often tell you that there's an important battle, but Izyum is one of the most high important ones, because any large-scale encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Donbass requires the control of Izyum. The city is separated in half by a river. The northern part is controlled by the Russians, the southern part by the Ukrainians. The Russians bypassed the stronghold using an amphibious river crossing further west from the city. And like that, they cut off Izyum from the south and controlled the villagers of, Kamyanka. This position cuts the road Izyum-Slavyansk, but also becomes one of the final stepping stones for the encirclement of the triangle Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Severodonetsk. Now, if I know it, the Ukrainian General Staff is 100% aware of it as well. They launched a lot of counterattacks. They knew that they couldn't stay on the defensive forever. Otherwise, you basically hand control of the campaign to the Russians. Apparently, 2 Ukrainian air brigades were sent to counterattack at Izyum, and another counterattack was launched from Kharkiv to cut off the Russians from the north of Izyum. Now, there's very little information about what happened there. Maybe we'll know in a couple decades. All we know is that the Russians are still in control of the ground, but we have no idea of casualties. And reportedly, the Russians are currently fighting for the city of Chuiv, southeast of Kharkiv. Again, that's a double stepping stone because it secures the road of Izyum, but it also could be used to encircle Kharkiv. Now, like I said before, the Ukrainian forces at Kharkiv are among the most elite ones of the entire Ukrainian armed forces. Not only did they push back the Russians further away from the outskirts, but the constant counteroffensives really scared the Russians, to the point where they don't even launch attacks anymore. The only thing the Russians can do is suppress enemy resistance using massive artillery and airstrikes. And the enemy number one of the Russian forces is enemy artillery and rocket launchers, as apparently they caused 90% of Russian losses. So I think that this time it's the Ukrainians that will have to advise NATO on how to use artillery. What's happening in Donbass? Now, the overall strategic situation in Donbass remained more or less the same. However, the tactical situation at Mariupol, Izyum, and all along the contact line poses a real threat to the Ukrainian armed forces grouping in the region. The Russians keep punching, capturing one village after another. At the same time, LDR and DPR forces fight for every village along the contact line, one by one, to pin down as many Ukrainian forces as possible, and thus avoid a coordinated withdrawal without a complete collapse. The separatist forces face among the most fortified defenses in all Ukraine, what I call the Ukrainian Maginot line. What I mean by fortified positions is a highly developed network of trenches that connect all the basements of homes in the villages along the contact line, and the concrete basements provide excellent protection against enemy fire. In a World War I fashion, they fight for every inch and suppress enemy positions using thermobaric missiles, which are extremely effective against entrenched personnel, field fortifications, and bunkers. Now, the Ukrainian General Staff knows that the situation in the area is critical, and they're withdrawing one unit at a time towards Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and Kyiv in a very slow but secure fashion. And we all know that a general that knows how to withdraw in order and coordinate a retreat is a great general by default. However, I feel that just like in Mariupol, some Ukrainian units might get sacrificed in order for the bulk of the troops to pull back. Now, the Battle of Mykolaiv. The Russians also launched a spearhead attack to capture the strategic city of Vozhnensk. Not only is it the only bridge north of Mykolaiv, but it allows to flank Mykolaiv from the north, and it opens the route to Odessa. At Mykolaiv, the Ukrainians not only stopped the Russian advance, but also counterattacked. The first one of the war of this scale for Ukraine, and the biggest Russian setback so far. And now Ukrainians are only 40 kilometers away from recapturing Kherson. Honestly, if the Russians lose Kherson, it's GG well played for them. In response, massive Russian reserves stationed at Kherson have been moved north. Now, if the Russians take Odessa, Ukraine becomes a landlocked nation, just like Moldova and Belarus in the region. And they don't want that. It's one of the most important Ukraine positions to hold, because it will become very important during peace negotiations. This is why the Ukrainians are actively defending Mykolaiv. Now their comrades at Odessa would like to support them, but Odessa is still threatened by the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is ready to launch an amphibious assault anytime. Therefore, a significant part of the Ukrainian armed forces are stuck in this area and cannot be used to fully support Mykolaiv. At the same time, Ukrainians suffered a devastating blow with the Russian missile attack on one of their barracks, and almost an entire battalion was put out of action. A heavy blow. For its part, the Russians have to secure the threat from Mykolaiv, but have made significant progress towards Nikopol and Kryvyi Rih. Kryvyi Rih is this city that I mentioned at the beginning of the video that if the Russians capture, it might be game over for Ukraine. From there, you basically cut off all the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. The Russians would be even at the rear of the second line of defense of Ukraine. If they take that city, forget defending the Dnieper. Like, there's no more stuff to defend. From there, the Russians could easily attack Zaporizhia and Dnipro. But as long as Mykolaiv holds, this nightmare scenario might not happen. The threat on the Russian left flank would just be too big to ignore. The reason I started with the southern front is because there's not much happening in the northern front and at Kiev. The problem there is that the Russians advanced very fast, but they left behind a lot of Ukrainian pockets. The biggest ones being in Chernihiv and Sumy. Meanwhile, at Kiev, Russian units have positioned their artillery and are mostly aiming to strengthen their positions in the region. They don't seem to be in a hurry to encircle the capital, since the current balance of force strongly favors the Ukrainians. Even if progress is really slow, the Russians keep pushing south. So I'm checking on the map real quickly, but I know that they bypassed Makariv and are taking more and more villages along the way towards Vasylkiv. Basically, if they manage to do that, the city will be effectively encircled. It seems that the bulk of Russian casualties happen near Kiev, because this is where they're sending most of their replacements. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian forces continued to reinforce combat units and reinforce its logistics system around Chernihiv in preparation for resumed attacks towards Brovary. Basically, the Russians can't complete the encirclement of the east bank of Kiev because their logistics are constantly being harassed by Ukrainian forces. So I think that we might see the bow of Chernihiv very soon. And if they don't, it means that Kiev is pretty safe. And I also want to know the name of the Ukrainian general at Chernihiv because he's been holding since day one. Whoa. Anyway, this is all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to help me create more content and get new equipment, don't forget to support me on Patreon.